He came to the mountains to outrun a memory made of sand. The memory had a sound, the frantic whine of a turbine fighting grit, and a weight, the specific burden of a choice he had made that was both correct and unforgivable. For 2 years, that memory had followed him from city to city, a silent, stalking thing that soured the taste of coffee and shortened his breath in crowded rooms. So he had packed his Eberlestock half-track, the same one he had carried through a dozen countries where the dust was old as time, and driven north until the roads narrowed and the silence was deep enough to have a pulse. The man, Elias Vance, was in his early 40s, but the stillness in his eyes belonged to someone much older. He was tall and lean, built of the dense, economical muscle that comes not from a gym, but from years of carrying weight over unforgiving ground. He moved with a quiet purpose that was the last vestige of a discipline he was trying to forget. His uniform never changed. Worn leather boots that had molded to his feet, faded cargo pants, a plaid flannel shirt, and an olive M65 field jacket that served as his shield against the world. On his wrist, he wore a military-issue watch, its face scratched and its ticking a steady, patient metronome counting out the seconds of his exile. He was not entirely alone. Beside him on the passenger seat of the old pickup sat Ghost. The German Shepherd was a veteran too, a fact written in the dignified silver that dusted his muzzle and the calm, knowing intelligence in his dark eyes. He was not a pet. He was a partner. Theirs was a bond forged in the crucible of shared danger, a language of posture and breath that had no need for words. Ghost was never entirely off duty, and as the truck rumbled over the gravel road that climbed into the Cascade Range, the dog was assessing, measuring the shift in air pressure, the scent of pine and damp earth, the vast, imposing quiet. Elias parked the truck with a road dissolved into a mere suggestion of a trail. He cut the engine. The silence that rushed in was not empty. It was layered with the whisper of wind through 100-foot firs, the distant cry of a hawk, and the low, steady murmur of a creek somewhere below. This was what he had come for. A silence so complete it might finally deafen the memory. He got out, the familiar crunch of his boots on gravel the only sound he made. Ghost hopped down, his paws landing without a whisper, and stood beside him, his body a study in alert stillness. They made camp a mile in, on a small, flat bluff overlooking a vast glacial lake whose surface was the color of hammered steel. Elias worked with practiced efficiency, his movements fluid and precise. He pitched the small tent, unrolled his sleeping bag, and set up his single-burner stove. Ghost watched him, his head cocked with an air of professional critique, as if judging the tautness of a guy line or the placement of a tent stake. Elias caught the look and felt the ghost of a smile touch his lips. The dog's quiet, judgmental superiority was a grounding presence, a familiar anchor in the disorienting sea of his own thoughts. For 3 days they fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the temperature. They walked the winding game trails, Elias with his hands in his jacket pockets, Ghost trotting just ahead, his tail held low and steady. Elias let his mind go blank, focusing on the texture of bark, the chill of the air, the way the light fractured through the dense canopy. He was trying to become a part of the landscape, to be as thoughtless and present as a stone. He was trying to unlearn the habit of vigilance that had kept him alive for 20 years. But the mountain was watchful too, and so was his dog. On the 4th morning, something shifted. The air was colder, heavy with the promise of rain. A low mist clung to the surface of the lake, blurring the line between water and sky. Elias was heating water for coffee when he noticed the change in Ghost. The dog, who had been lying with his chin on his paws, was now sitting upright, as rigid as a statue. His ears were swiveled forward, his nostrils flared, and the fur along his spine was subtly raised. He was not looking at anything Elias could see. He was listening to something Elias could not hear. Elias killed the flame on the stove. The hiss of the burner died, and the silence deepened. He trusted the dog's instincts more than his own. Ghost's senses were a finely tuned instrument that had warned him of unseen threats more times than he could count. He remained perfectly still, scanning the dense tree line, his own senses straining. He saw nothing, heard nothing but the wind. Ghost let out a low, almost inaudible puff of air, a sound of deep concentration. He turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping across a section of the forest to their north, an area of particularly thick, old-growth timber they had not yet explored. He looked back at Elias, a clear question in his eyes. Elias gave a slow, deliberate nod. Permission granted. The dog moved without a sound, melting into the underbrush like his namesake. Elias pulled on his jacket, slipped a small compass into his pocket, and checked his watch. He left the camp as it was and followed, his steps as quiet as the falling pine needles. The unease was a familiar sensation, a cold knot tightening in his gut. It was the feeling that came before contact, the moment when the world held its breath. He had come here to escape that feeling, but it seemed the mountain had other plans. The memory of sand felt suddenly, terribly close. Ghost did not follow a trail. He moved with a singular purpose, pushing through thickets of salal and sword fern that soaked the legs of Elias's pants with cold dew. He was following a scent, an anomaly on the wind that had snagged his attention. Elias followed the dog, his mind clearing, the fog of his self-imposed exile burning away. The instincts he had tried to suppress were reawakening, sharp and clear. He noted the direction of the wind, the age of the trees, the unnatural quiet of the birds. Something was wrong. After 20 minutes of hard walking, Ghost stopped. They were in a part of the forest that felt older, darker. The firs and cedars were giants, their massive trunks blocking out the sky, creating a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. Moss grew thick on every surface, hanging from branches in long, ghostly veils. The air was still and cold. Ghost stood at the base of a colossal fallen cedar, its root ball a tangled wall of earth and wood taller than a man. He did not bark or whine. He simply stood there, his body taut, and stared at a specific spot on the ground. Elias came up beside him, placing a calming hand on the dog's neck. The fur was still raised. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Ghost lowered his head and nudged a patch of moss with his nose. Then he began to dig, not with the frantic energy of a dog chasing a squirrel, but with a methodical, deliberate scraping of his front paws. He uncovered a layer of dark, rich soil, and then something else, something that glinted with a dull, metallic sheen. Elias knelt. He brushed away the dirt. It was a strip of metal, about 3 feet long and 4 inches wide. It was weathered and corroded, but it was clearly man-made. It looked like a piece of aluminum paneling, riveted along one edge. It was partially buried, angled down into the earth. It was not a random piece of trash. Its placement felt intentional. He looked at Ghost, who sat back on his haunches, his work done. The dog looked from the metal to Elias, then back again. "See?" his posture seemed to say. "I told you." Elias pulled his folding knife from his pocket and used the tip to scrape away more of the soil around the object. The more he uncovered, the less sense it made. It was not just a panel. It was connected to a larger structure. He followed its line, digging with his hands and the knife, the cold earth numbing his fingers. He was a cartographer of a buried thing, tracing its shape under the skin of the forest. After an hour of careful excavation, he had uncovered a section of what looked like a wing. A short, straight wing, with faded, almost invisible markings just behind the leading edge. He stood up, wiping his muddy hands on his pants, and took a step back to gain perspective. He looked at the angle of the wing, the direction it pointed. He looked at the trees around them. They were ancient. None of them were broken or scarred. This was not a crash site. A plane had not fallen from the sky here. His training took over. The years of pattern recognition and tactical assessment clicking into place. If it did not crash here, then it was here before the trees grew to this size. Or it was brought here. He scanned the surrounding terrain. To the north, the ground sloped gently upwards. The trees, he now noticed, were subtly different in that direction. They were still large, but they were more uniform in age, younger than the giants around him. They were growing in unnaturally straight lines. He left the half-buried wing and started walking north, Ghost at his heel. He pushed through the line of younger trees, and the world opened up. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. Before him was a runway. It was almost completely reclaimed by nature, a long, straight scar of land covered in a carpet of moss and populated by rows of adolescent firs. But it was unmistakable. It was nearly a mile long, perfectly flat and straight, oriented east to west. At the far western end, nearly swallowed by the encroaching forest, was a building. A hangar. Its corrugated metal walls were streaked with rust, and its arched roof was tattooed with moss and lichen. Elias walked out onto the center of the ghostly airstrip. The silence here was different, heavier. It was the silence of a place that had once been filled with noise and purpose. He could almost hear the phantom roar of an engine, the shouts of men, the metallic clang of tools. He looked down. Beneath the moss, his boots scuffed against crumbling asphalt. He walked the length of the runway, his pace steady, his eyes scanning every detail. Ghost padded silently beside him, his earlier tension replaced by a watchful curiosity. The place felt like a tomb, a monument to a secret someone had tried to bury under a blanket of trees and time. The hangar was even more imposing up close. Its massive sliding door was shut fast, a heavy-duty padlock, green with age, securing a thick chain. The metal of the door was warped and buckled in places, but it had held. Elias ran his hand over the cold, rough steel. Locked. Of course it was locked. Secrets were always kept under lock and key. He circled the building. The windows, set high up near the roofline, were opaque with decades of grime. The metal walls were seamless, rooted in a concrete foundation. There was no obvious way in. This was not a flimsy barn. It was a fortress. It was built to keep something in, or to keep the world out. He completed his circuit and returned to the main door. He stood before it, the quiet hum of the forest behind him, the immense, silent weight of the hangar before him. Ghost sat at his feet, looking up at the door, then at him. The dog seemed to understand. The discovery of the wing fragment was only the first sentence. The rest of the story was in here. Elias looked at his watch. The afternoon was waning. He needed more information. A place like this did not exist without a paper trail, no matter how deeply it was buried. It would exist on a map, in a deed, in a surveyor's log. He needed context. He needed a name. He made a decision. He would go to town. He turned his back on the hangar, a strange reluctance pulling at him. He felt as if he were leaving a post he had just been assigned. "Come on, boy," he said, his voice rough from disuse. They walked back across the runway, the young trees standing like silent sentinels in the fading light. As he re-entered the old-growth forest, he glanced back one last time. The hangar was a dark shape against the darkening sky, a locked box full of forgotten questions. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was the one who was meant to find the key. The nearest town was a place called North Fork, a small cluster of buildings huddled on the shore of the lake, 30 miles of winding road from his camp. It was a town that time seemed to have largely ignored, with a single gas station, a diner with a buzzing neon sign, and a squat brick building that housed the post office, the sheriff's office, and the county clerk. It was to this building that Elias drove the next morning, Ghost waiting patiently in the truck. The clerk's office smelled of old paper, floor wax, and weak coffee. A woman with a formidable gray bun and sharp, intelligent eyes looked up from behind a high counter. Her nameplate read, Arlene Moss, County Ranger and Records. She watched him approach with a neutral, assessing gaze that missed nothing, from the scuff on his boots to the disciplined set of his shoulders. "Can I help you?" Her voice was low and businesslike. "I'm looking for old survey maps of the area," Elias said. "Specifically, the federal lands north of the lake, Quadrant 7. Arlene Moss raised a skeptical eyebrow. "That's remote country. Nothing out there but trees." "You a prospector?" "Something like that," Elias said, offering no more. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze lingering on the faded insignia patch on his jacket sleeve, a ghost of a trident he had never bothered to remove. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "We've digitized most of the modern plots. The old vellums are in the back. Not many people ask for those." "Those are the ones I need," he said. She disappeared into a back room and returned a few minutes later, her arms laden with heavy, rolled tubes of drafting paper. She spread one out on the counter, weighing the corners down. It was a survey from 1952. The detail was exquisite, every contour line and creek bed drawn by a patient hand. "Quadrant 7, she said, tapping a section of the map. "All national forest, transferred from the Bureau of Land Management in '48. Elias leaned over the map, his eyes tracing the familiar landscape. He found the bluff where he had made his camp, the creek that fed the lake. And then he found the anomaly. It was a perfect square of land, 640 acres, precisely where the airstrip was. On this 1952 map, it was marked simply as U.S. federal property, restricted. "Can I see something from later? Say, the 70s? Arlene rolled up the map and produced another, this one dated 1978. The paper was newer, the lines printed rather than drawn. Elias found the same section. The square was still there, but the designation had changed. It was now listed as privately held by a corporation he had never heard of. Ethelstan Heritage Trust. There was a deed number noted in the margin. Ethelstan Heritage Trust, Elias read aloud. "Ever hear of them?" Arlene shook her head. "Never. Probably some holding company. They bought it, paid taxes for a few years, and then nothing. The deed is still in their name, but the entity itself dissolved in 1982. The property has been in limbo ever since. We can't seize it for back taxes because the ownership is a legal ghost. It's just there, a forgotten parcel." She looked at him, her curiosity piqued. "Why the interest in a dead plot of land?" "I found something there," Elias said simply. "Something that shouldn't be." Her gaze sharpened. She recognized the tone in his voice, the quiet weight of a man who did not speak idly. She slid a small notepad and a pen across the counter. "My number. If you find something you think the Forest Service should know about, you call me." It was not a request. Elias took the paper and nodded. "Thank you for your time, Ranger Moss." He left the office with the name of a dead corporation and a new ally, whether she knew it or not. His next stop was the diner. He needed to find someone who dealt not in paper,
but in memory.
The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes, pointed him toward a booth in the back where an old man sat alone, meticulously studying a plate of scrambled eggs. "You want to know about Old Land? You talk to Samuel Finch," she said. "He surveyed most of this county with his own 2 feet." Elias approached the booth. Samuel Finch looked up, his eyes a startlingly bright blue in his weathered face. He was thin and wiry, with hands gnarled from a lifetime of work. "Mr. Finch?" Elias asked. "Depends on who's asking," the old man said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "My name is Elias Vance. I was told you know the land around here better than anyone." Samuel gestured to the seat opposite him. Elias slid into the booth. He bought the man a cup of coffee and laid out what he knew, omitting the hangar and the wing, speaking only of an odd, flat clearing and a strange corporate deed from the 70s. Samuel listened, his head tilted, a faint smile playing on his lips. When Elias finished, he took a long sip of his coffee. "The Ghost Strip," he said, his voice dropping. "Haven't heard that name in 30 years. Ghost Strip? That's what we called it. I was just a kid, apprenticing with the county surveyor back in the late 50s. The feds came in, locked down that whole section. Said it was for a meteorological research station. But we heard the planes. Small ones, fast ones, coming and going at odd hours, always at dusk or just before dawn. No lights, just shapes against the sky. Then one day in the late 70s, it all just stopped. The guards were gone. The gate was chained. It was like they had just vanished." "And the Ethelstan Heritage Trust?" Elias asked. Samuel chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "That was the cover story, the official reason for the shutdown. Some private ecological group was taking it over to rewild the area. It was nonsense. It was a way to bury it, to scrub it off the maps and out of the budgets." You bury something deep enough, people forget they were ever supposed to be looking for it. He leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. Whatever they were doing out there, they wanted it to be forgotten. Real bad.
Elias drove back to the airstrip, the old man's words echoing in his mind. They wanted it to be forgotten. He parked the truck and walked with Ghost through the twilight, the sense of purpose solidifying within him. He now had the what, if not the why. A secret government installation, scrubbed from history. He stood before the locked hangar door again. He had no intention of cutting the lock. Forced entry was loud and messy. It was an admission of defeat. He believed in what his training had taught him. There is always another way in. The people who built this place, who operated from it in secret, would have had contingencies. He began a systematic search of the hangar's perimeter, not looking for a weakness, but for a hidden logic.
He ran his hands along the concrete foundation, feeling for variations in texture. He measured the distance between the support pillars. He studied the pattern of rust stains, looking for one that seemed out of place. It was a form of meditation, a dialogue with the building itself. Ghost sat patiently, watching him, as if he knew this was a puzzle that required a different kind of tool. It was near the back corner of the hangar, half hidden by a thick growth of ferns, that Elias found it. A single bolt in the corrugated metal wall, at waist height. Unlike the others, which were rusted solid, this one was made of stainless steel. It was disguised with a dab of paint and fake rust, a masterful piece of camouflage. But it was different. Elias pulled his multi-tool from a pouch on his belt and fitted a screwdriver head to the bolt. It was stiff, but it turned. After several rotations, a section of the metal wall, about 3 feet square, clicked inward. It was a maintenance hatch, perfectly concealed. He pulled it open, revealing a dark, narrow space. The air that flowed out was cold and stale, the smell of contained time. He took a small flashlight from his pack, clicked it on, and peered inside. A narrow utility corridor ran along the back of the hangar. He swung himself through the opening, his movements tight and controlled. Ghost followed, squeezing through the space with a grunt. They were in. The corridor was thick with dust and cobwebs. At the far end, a simple interior door stood ajar. Elias pushed it open and stepped out of the corridor and into the cavernous main space of the hangar. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene frozen in time. In the center of the hangar sat a small aircraft. It was a single-engine prop plane, painted a matte, non-reflective gray. Its design was unfamiliar, with long, slender wings and a cockpit bubble that offered a panoramic view.
It was a surveillance plane, built for loitering silently at high altitude. Dust lay on it like a shroud. Around the plane, the hangar was set up like a Spartan military outpost. Cots were folded against one wall. A workbench was littered with tools and schematics. A radio console sat silently under a canvas cover. It was as if the occupants had simply walked away mid-shift, expecting to return. But it was what stood in the corner that drew Elias's attention. A large, green, military-issue footlocker. It was not locked. He knelt before it, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. He lifted the lid. Inside were not clothes or personal effects. It was an archive. There were dozens of reels of audio tape, each one meticulously labeled with a date and a code number. There were stacks of logbooks, their pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. And on top of it all was a slim, leather-bound journal. Elias lifted the journal. He opened it to the first page. Written there, in a familiar, confident script, was a name that made the air leave his lungs. Lieutenant Commander David Sterling. Project Nightingale. Log Entry 1. David Sterling. A man Elias had served with. A man whose memory was tangled up with the sand and the guilt he had carried for years. A man who had officially died in a helicopter crash in the Korengal Valley. But he had not died. He had been here. Elias sat on the cold concrete floor, the flashlight beam illuminating the page. He began to read. The logbooks and the journal told a chilling story. Project Nightingale was not meteorological research. It was an illegal domestic surveillance program run by a Black Ops division of the CIA during the Cold War. From this hidden airstrip, Sterling and a small crew had flown missions to spy on American citizens, anti-war protesters, civil rights leaders, politicians deemed subversive. The early entries were professional, detached, but as the years went on, Sterling's tone began to change. Doubt crept in, then disgust. He was a patriot, a man who believed in the Constitution, and he had been ordered to betray its most fundamental principles. The final entries from 1977 were frantic. The project was being shut down, not officially, but buried. The crew was being scattered, their records expunged. Sterling knew he was a loose end. He wrote of hiding the true logs, the audio tapes of his superiors giving illegal orders, creating this time capsule in the hope that someone, someday, would find it. "They are turning us into the enemy we are meant to be fighting," he wrote on the last page. "I will not be a party to it. I will not be silent." And then the journal ended. Elias felt a profound, aching sorrow. The David Sterling he knew had been a man of fierce integrity. Now he understood. The official story of his death was a lie, a cover for his disappearance. He had become a whistleblower, and he had been silenced. Suddenly, the memory that haunted Elias became sharp and clear. A dusty village in Afghanistan, a mission to capture a high-value target. Their local informant,
a man with a family, had been compromised. The order came down from command. Leave him. Securing the target was the priority. Elias had been the team leader. Sterling, his second in command, had argued passionately, fiercely, to go back for the informant. "We don't leave our people," Sterling had insisted. But the order was clear. Elias had made the call. He chose the mission. He chose the objective. They got their target. The informant and his family were found and executed the next day. He had carried that choice like a stone in his gut. But now, sitting in this dusty hangar, he saw it in a new light. Sterling had been right, not just tactically, but morally. And the system that had forced Elias to make that impossible choice was the same system that had taken Sterling, a good man, and tried to erase him from existence. The injustice was a fractal, repeating itself in the sand of Afghanistan and the deep woods of Washington state. He was still processing this seismic shift in his own history when Ghost, who had been lying quietly, suddenly lifted his head. A low rumble started deep in his chest. It was not a sound of alarm, but of warning. Elias was on his feet in an instant, the flashlight off. He moved to the crack in the main hangar door, peering out. Headlights were sweeping across the airstrip. A vehicle was approaching. It was a pristine black SUV, its engine a low, expensive purr that sounded alien in the profound quiet of the forest. It rolled to a stop 50 feet from the hangar. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He was in his 50s, dressed in a tailored suit that looked absurdly out of place. He was handsome, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being in charge. He walked toward the hangar, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravelly moss. Elias stepped back from the door, his hand resting on Ghost's head to keep him silent. The man stopped at the change door and examined the old padlock as if it were a minor inconvenience. He took out a phone, tapped on it, and spoke, his voice calm and clear. "Thorne here. I'm at the site. The asset is secure. There's some minor local interference, a camper. I'll handle it. Send the team. Dawn." He put the phone away and turned, his gaze sweeping across the silent forest, across the very spot where Elias's truck was hidden. He smiled, a thin, predatory expression. Then he got back in his SUV and drove away, leaving only silence and the tire tracks in the moss. The man's name was Thorne, and he was coming back. Elias looked down at the footlocker, at the legacy of a man he had wronged. The mission was no longer about the past. It was about the present. He had been given a second chance. This time, he would not leave anyone behind. Time was a currency he no longer had. Thorne and his team were coming at dawn. Elias knew what that meant. They were not here to preserve history. They were here to erase it, permanently. The hangar, the plane, the footlocker, it would all be cut up, hauled away, and melted down until the secret was nothing but slag and whispers. He worked quickly, his movements economical and sure. He could not take the entire footlocker. It was too heavy, too cumbersome. He had to triage the evidence. He selected the most critical items: Sterling's personal journal, a dozen of the audio reels that seemed to document the most damning orders, and the final logbook with the panicked entries. He packed them carefully into his Everly stock, cushioning them with a spare shirt. The weight of the pack was familiar, but the burden felt different. It was not the weight of ammunition and explosives, but of a man's life and a nation's compromised honor. He paused, his hand hovering over the remaining tapes. Leaving them felt like a betrayal. He thought of Sterling, of the informant in the dusty village. He could not take it all, but he could make it harder for them. Using his knife, he pried the covers off several of the remaining reel-to-reel tapes and pulled the magnetic tape out, tangling it into an irreparable mess. It was a small act of defiance, but it felt necessary. As he worked, Ghost remained by his side, a silent, watchful shadow. The dog's presence was a comfort, a steady point in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. Every few minutes the dog would raise his head, his ears twitching, listening to the sounds of the forest, ensuring they remained alone. When he was finished, Elias resealed the maintenance hatch from the inside, leaving no trace of his entry. There was only one way out now, the main door. Thorne's team would come through it, and he had to be long gone before they did. Just as he shouldered his pack, he had an idea. It was a risk, a long shot, but it was better than nothing. He took the small notepad from his pocket, the one with Ranger Arlene Moss's number. He had a weak signal on his satellite phone, not enough for a call, but perhaps enough for a short text. He typed a message, his fingers clumsy in the cold. Quadrant 7 Airstrip. Hangar. Corporate team coming at dawn to destroy evidence. U.S. government property. Request immediate assistance. He added the coordinates he'd taken from his GPS. He hit send. The phone struggled, then flashed a single, hopeful word. Sent. He had no idea if it had gone through, or if she would even believe him. It was a flare fired into the darkness. He crept to the edge of the hangar door and peered through the crack. The sky to the east was just beginning to lighten, a faint gray promise that felt more like a threat. He had to move now. He gave Ghost a silent hand signal. Quiet. The dog seemed to nod, his body low to the ground. Elias slipped out of the hangar, melting into the deep shadows at the edge of the tree line. He moved parallel to the runway, using the cover of the young firs to mask his retreat. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the pre-dawn stillness. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear, but with a cold, focused adrenaline. This was the wire, the liminal space between safety and discovery that he had lived in for most of his life. They had almost reached the southern edge of the runway when Ghost suddenly froze, dropping to the ground, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Elias flattened himself behind a thicket of ferns, peering through the leaves. Two powerful beams of light cut through the darkness. A large flatbed truck, its engine a low diesel rumble, was turning onto the airstrip, followed by the black SUV. Thorne's team had arrived early. Elias watched as 4 men got out of the truck. They were not dressed in suits. They wore dark work clothes and carried heavy tool bags. They moved with a grim efficiency, their faces illuminated by the headlights. One of them carried a plasma cutter. Thorne emerged from the SUV and pointed toward the hangar door. He gave orders in a low, clipped voice that carried in the cold air. There was no way for Elias to cross the open ground to the old-growth forest without being seen. He was trapped. He and Ghost were pinned down in the thin cover of the new-growth trees. He backed away slowly, deeper into the stand of firs, hoping the morning mist and the deep shadows would be enough. The sound of a generator kicking to life shattered the silence, followed by the angry hiss of the plasma cutter. They were starting on the lock. Elias knew he had only minutes. He had to circle around to find another path back to the deep woods where he could lose them. As he began to move, the wind picked up, moaning through the trees. The sky, which had been gray, was now a bruised, angry purple. The promised rain was coming. A storm. The temperature dropped, and the first cold drops began to fall, pattering on the leaves around him. The wind grew stronger, whipping through the trees in powerful gusts. A loud groaning sound came from the direction of the hangar, followed by a sharp crack. Elias looked up. A large section of the old, rusted metal roofing, weakened by decades of decay and now caught by a violent gust, tore free from its moorings. It cartwheeled through the air for a moment, a dark, jagged shape against the stormy sky, and then crashed down into the tree line,
not 50 feet from where he and Ghost were hiding. Ghost yelped, a sharp cry of pain that was immediately swallowed by a clap of thunder. Elias's blood ran cold. He scrambled to the dog's side. The sheet of metal had not hit him directly, but a sharp projecting edge had sliced across his left hind leg as it came down. A deep gash was welling with dark blood. Ghost was trying to get up, but his leg buckled underneath him. He whimpered, a sound of pain and confusion, and licked at the wound. The choice hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. It was the memory, made real. The mission was the pack on his back, the evidence that could bring justice for Sterling. The escape route was a dangerous but possible path through the growing storm. The objective was to get away, to get the truth out. And here was the casualty. His partner, wounded and unable to travel. He could leave him. He could hide Ghost as best he could, promise to come back for him, and save the mission. It was the logical choice. The cold calculus of the operator, the needs of the many, the importance of the intelligence. It was the choice he had made in the dust of Afghanistan. He could still hear Sterling's voice in his head, raw with disbelief. "We don't leave our people, Elias." The hiss of the plasma cutter from the hangar was a mocking reminder that time was running out. He looked at the pack on his back, then down at Ghost. The dog looked up at him, his dark eyes filled with trust and pain. He was not asking to be saved. He was simply waiting for his partner's decision. In that moment, the 20 years of training, of hardening his heart, of putting the mission above all else, crumbled to dust. The guilt he had carried was not about a tactical error. It was about a moral failure. He had chosen the abstract over the real. He had sacrificed a life for a goal. He would not do it again. "Okay, boy," he whispered, his voice thick. "Okay. We stay." He shrugged off the pack and gently laid it at the base of a thick tree. He unzipped a side pocket and pulled out his first aid kit. The movements were automatic, ingrained from years of treating wounds in far worse places than this. He knelt beside Ghost, his hands moving with a surgeon's calm. "This is going to hurt," he said softly. As he worked, applying pressure to the wound, cleaning it as best he could in the driving rain, he could hear Thorne shouting orders over the storm. The hangar door shrieked as it was forced open. Lights flooded the interior. Elias finished bandaging Ghost's leg, wrapping it tightly. The bleeding had slowed. He gave the dog a piece of a high-energy bar from his pocket, which Ghost took gently. He looked for a place to make a stand. A few yards away, a cluster of fallen logs and dense undergrowth formed a natural fortification. It was not much, but it was defensible. He half-carried, half-guided the limping dog to the small hollow and settled him down, along with the pack. He was no longer thinking about escape. He was thinking about defense. He pulled his knife. It was a pathetic weapon against a team of men, but it was what he had. He was a soldier again, but this time, he was fighting for a different reason. Not for a flag, not for an order, but for the life of his friend. He would hold this ground. He would not run. Through the sheets of rain, he saw one of Thorne's men walking the perimeter of the airstrip with a powerful flashlight. The man was younger than the others, with a short military-style haircut. He was sweeping the beam methodically across the tree line. He was a professional. The beam passed over their position and then snapped back. The man froze, his flashlight pinning Elias in its glare. He saw Elias kneeling, one hand on his wounded dog, the other holding a knife. He saw the pack. He saw the look in Elias's eyes. The man raised a hand to his mouth to shout, to alert the others. But he hesitated. His eyes flickered from Elias to the dog, to the careful bandage on its leg. A flicker of something. Recognition, conflict, memory crossed his face. He had seen that look before, the look of a man protecting his brother in arms. Thorne's voice bellowed from the hangar. "Collins, what do you see?" The young man, Collins, lowered his flashlight slightly so it was no longer blinding Elias. He stood there for a long second, caught between two worlds. Then he turned his head and shouted back, his voice nearly lost in the wind and rain. "Nothing. Just the storm. This roof panel came down hard. I'm checking the tree line for more damage." It was a lie. A clean, simple lie. He had made a choice. Collins swept the beam away, continuing his patrol as if he had seen nothing. He had given them a gift, a few minutes of borrowed time. But Elias knew it would not last. Thorne was not a man who would leave anything to chance. He would order a full sweep. Suddenly, through the roar of the storm, another sound emerged. A high, piercing siren.
Headlights cut through the rain from the far end of the airstrip. A vehicle was coming, fast. It was a Forest Service truck, its emergency lights flashing, painting the trees in strobes of red and blue. Ranger Arlene Moss's truck skidded to a halt near the hangar, its headlights illuminating the whole scene. Thorne standing in the open hangar, his crew frozen in place, the plasma cutter lying on the ground, smoking in the rain. She stepped out of the truck, a shotgun held in a casual but ready position. She was not alone. A county sheriff's deputy emerged from the passenger side. "This is a restricted federal heritage site, Mr. Thorne," Arlene's voice boomed, easily carrying over the storm. "You are in violation of a dozen federal and state statutes. I suggest your men put down their tools. Now." Thorne stared at her, his polite mask finally cracking, revealing the raw fury beneath. His plan, so close to completion, had unraveled in a matter of minutes. His gaze swept to the tree line, searching for the cause of his failure. Elias remained hidden, his hand on Ghost. He watched as the balance of power shifted completely. The lie told by the young man named Collins had bought just enough time for the flare he had fired into the dark to be answered. The tide had turned, and all because he had made a choice. He had chosen to stay. The morning broke clean and cold. The storm had passed, scrubbing the air and leaving the world dripping and gleaming. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The airstrip, however, was no longer a quiet, forgotten place. It was a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off the hangar. Ranger Moss's truck was parked beside a state police cruiser. Elias sat on a fallen log at the edge of the forest, Ghost lying at his feet. The dog's bandaged leg was stretched out, and he occasionally licked at it, but his breathing was even and calm. A state police medic, a young woman with kind eyes, had checked the wound and pronounced Elias's field dressing textbook. He watched as Marcus Thorne, no longer composed or powerful, was escorted to the cruiser. His tailored suit was rumpled and stained with mud. He looked small and insignificant without his armor of authority. The members of his crew sat on the tarmac, being questioned one by one. Elias saw the young one, Collins. Their eyes met for a brief second across the clearing. Collins gave a barely perceptible nod, an acknowledgement that passed between two men who understood the landscape of difficult choices. Then he looked away. Arlene Moss walked over to Elias, a steaming mug in her hand. She handed it to him. It was strong, black coffee. "The real stuff," she said. "Figured you could use it." "Thank you," Elias said, his voice hoarse. He wrapped his cold hands around the warmth of the mug. "My office got your text at 4:37, she said, looking out at the scene. "Woke up half the county. Good thing you were specific. Those tapes. The state AG is on his way from the Capitol. This is going to be big." She shook her head in disbelief. A secret Cold War surveillance base, right under our noses for 50 years.
She looked down at the pack at Elias's feet. The journal you mentioned. The man who wrote it, Lieutenant Commander Sterling. His name is already ringing bells in some very high places. They thought he was a hero who died in combat. Turns out he was a hero of a different kind. Elias nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. The heat spread through his chest. He was a good man. Arlene was quiet for a moment. The kid, Collins, the one on Thorne's crew, ex-Army Ranger. He's the one who told us about you. Said he saw a guy with a dog in the woods. Said he knew you weren't a threat.
Said you looked like you were protecting something. She gave Elias a knowing look.
He bought you the time we needed.
Elias looked at Ghost, who thumped his tail weakly against the ground. He had tried to save his dog, and in doing so, had saved everything else. It was a strange and humbling equation. The simple act of loyalty had been more powerful than any tactical plan.
What will you do now? Arlene asked.
It was the question he had been avoiding for 2 years. He had been defined by what he was running from. Now, the memory of sand and failure felt distant, replaced by the sharp, clear memory of rain, thunder, and a choice made. He was no longer a man in exile. He had a new bearing, a new point on his internal compass. He pulled out his satellite phone. It had a full charge now, thanks to a generator Arlene had running. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over a name he had not called in years. He pressed the button. It rang twice. A woman's voice, cautious and laced with sleep, answered.
Hello?
Sarah, he said. The name felt strange on his tongue. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line.
Elias? Is that you? Are you okay?
I'm okay, he said, and was surprised to find that it was true. I'm in Washington. There was some trouble, but it's over now.
Trouble? What kind of trouble?
The worry in his sister's voice was a physical thing, a connection he had forgotten he had. The kind that's finished, he said. He looked up at the vast blue sky, at the towering green of the forest. I think I might be coming home soon. The silence on the line was filled with unspoken history, with years of distance. Then her voice came back, softer.
Okay, Eli. The door's always open, you know that.
I know, he said. I'll call you again in a day or two. He ended the call, a profound sense of release washing over him. A bridge he thought had been burned was still standing. He just had to be willing to walk across it. He looked at Arlene Moss, who had given him the privacy of his call. You asked what I'm going to do, he said. This area has a pretty active search and rescue unit, right? I hear they're always looking for volunteers, especially ones who come with their own canine. A slow, genuine smile spread across Arlene's face. I think we could find a place for a man like you, Mr. Vance. I think we could do that. He had come to the mountains to lose himself. Instead, he had found a purpose. He had been given a mission not by an order from command, but by the quiet insistence of a ghost in a hangar. The story of David Sterling would be told. The injustice would be brought into the light. And Elias Vance, the man who ran from his past, had finally found a reason to stay. Weeks later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the valley. Elias stood on a high ridge, the same one he had camped on when he first arrived. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and the coming winter. Beside him, Ghost sat, his posture regal. He had a slight, almost imperceptible limp in his left hind leg, a silver scar hidden in his dark fur. It was a part of his story now, a mark of loyalty earned and given. Below them, the airstrip was quiet. The yellow tape was gone. The hangar door stood slightly ajar, like a book waiting to be read. It had been designated a National Historic Site of Conscience. Scholars and investigators now walked where Thorne's demolition crew had intended to tread, carefully piecing together the full story of Project Nightingale and the brave man who had tried to stop it. The truth, once buried, was now protected. Elias was no longer a visitor here. He wore the dark green jacket of the county search and rescue team. His own olive field jacket was folded away in his truck. He had found a new uniform, a new purpose. He and Ghost had already been on 2 calls, one for a lost hiker and another for a skier caught in an early snow. They had found both. The memory of the dusty village in Afghanistan was still there. It would always be a part of him. But it no longer had the power to haunt him. It was a scar, not a wound. It had been cauterized by the choice he had made in the storm, the decision to trade a mission for a friend. That single act of grace had rebalanced the scales of his soul. He reached down and placed his hand on Ghost's broad head. The dog leaned into his touch, a familiar, grounding pressure. They stood together, 2 old soldiers, looking out over the vast, wild country that had become their home. They were no longer running. They were watching. They were on duty. And for the first time in a long time, Elias Vance felt a quiet, profound, and unshakable peace. The mountain had held its breath, and then, finally, it had let him breathe, too.